Right, let's talk a little further on that. Institute of Election Management Services in Africa Chair Terry Tselane joins us now for more on that conversation on leveling the playing field for the parties competing in this political arena for the 2024 elections in South Africa. But first, let's welcome and thank you very much for your time. Let's start with the proclamation in itself. What does it actually mean? I mean, we're hearing that, of course, it means that an elections timetable now comes into effect immediately, outlining the activities that need to happen, including the recognition of independence and the recognition of political parties that will participate.
Okay, let me put it this way, that technically, you can actually have the elections on different days, in a sense that the Constitution bestows powers on the premiers to determine the date for the provincial elections. Now, the Electoral Act, and then normally what happens is that the premiers will then consult with the president and the commission in order to arrive at one day for the elections, because it becomes a bit more expensive. So Section 17 of the Electoral Act then bestows the powers on the president to proclaim the date of the elections after the announcement. And Section 18 bestows those powers to the premier. So the premiers will be proclaiming the date of the elections as well as the president, as I indicated in terms of Section 17 and Section 18 of the Electoral Act.
Right.
Now, immediately after that, the commission has got to publish, has got to consult firstly with the party liaison committee, and then publish the election timetable. They do this in terms of Section 20 of the Electoral Act. Now, once they've done that, once the proclamation has happened, the voters' roll closes immediately. In other words, no one can now register. If you register, you will not be able to participate in this election.
If you're out, you're out. If you're in, you're in.
Yeah. And then immediately after that, various milestones will be indicated, which would include the time by which voters' roll can be inspected, the time by which the political parties and candidates can submit their lists, and the objections thereof to the list, and then all those milestones will then be contained within the election timetable.
Yeah. So I believe that is also when, from what I'm hearing, that the Electoral Code of Conduct now kicks in earnest in terms of the activities of the political parties.
Yes, the political parties now, once they submit their list, firstly they've got to commit themselves that they're going to be bound by the Code of Conduct. Candidates themselves also will be binding themselves to the Code of Conduct, that they'll be abide by the provisions as contained within the Code of Conduct. So the Code of Conduct becomes very important in terms of regulating the environment within which the elections will be taking place.
Yeah. So, I mean, police in KwaZulu-Natal have just recently reported an unprecedented spike in terms of contract killings, most of them related to economic activities, but also to political activities. So they're linked very much to people and their political office and these upcoming elections. So the electoral protest or the electoral process characterized by instances of intolerance. Some of them we're already beginning to see playing themselves out on social media. Can the Electoral Code of Conduct help us with that? Are there adequate institutional frameworks for mediating and managing that kind of electoral misconduct?
In fact, that is the most important aspect about the Electoral Code of Conduct. Its aim is to basically regulate the environment within which the elections take place, to ensure that that environment is conducive for free and fair elections. As I've already suggested, firstly, the political parties bind themselves, as well as the candidates, but also the political parties, in binding themselves, they indicate that they will ensure that their supporters also are bound by the Code of Conduct, and that they also conduct themselves in accordance with the provisions within the Code of Conduct.
Yeah. In your experience, I mean, in your time that you have been at the Commission, what is it about our democratization process that makes it so, for it to be so easily susceptible to electoral intolerance?
Well, I think there's actually been a high degree of development since 1994. You will recall that in 1994 and subsequent to 1994 elections, there were certain areas that were regarded as no-go areas. So political parties could not actually contest for support or canvass for support in certain areas because they were regarded as strongholds of certain parties, and therefore they would not allow other political parties. But there's been a serious development since then. And to a large extent, all the elections that have actually taken place, there has never really been the violence in that scale. And in the protests that happen, they happen outside the areas where voting is taking place, and it is largely as a result of people trying to raise issues that they feel affect them. So I think there is a level of tolerance amongst the political parties. Of course, there is going to be a level of contestation, and they're going to be saying all sorts of things, but in general, I think the South African elections have actually been characterized by very peaceful electoral processes. There is a matter that you have raised earlier on, which relates to political killings.
Yeah.
That, I think, it's a matter that must be attended to by security agencies. There are no measures in electoral law that can actually be able to monitor a person who at night goes out and then kills another person. It's a matter that must be attended to through normal processes that are there in legislation, particularly the security legislation, in order to be able to make sure that, people who participate in the process participates fully protected by the instruments of law.
So the South African Human Rights Commission has placed this at a lack of education. In fact, what they are saying is that there should be an education that is carried out, political education, about the universal practice of peaceful political competition. Is that something that could certainly be played by the IEC?
IEC has got to do that. But it is not only the responsibility of the IEC. The electoral process is a joint responsibility between the Electoral Commission, political parties, civil society organizations. All of them have got a role to play in terms of making sure that the environment within which things happen, within which the elections happen, is conducive for free and fair elections. And therefore, voter education is critical. Political parties have got to teach their members, they've got to make sure that their supporters understand the framework within which the elections happen. The IEC has got that responsibility as well, but the civil society organization also have got that responsibility. Yeah.
And why is that important? I mean, yourself, you're called upon within the Southern African region, the bloc itself, to monitor elections. What's the impact of that level of intolerance, maybe that we have not yet seen in South Africa, but that you witness in other parts of the continent?
Of course, it can affect the legitimacy of the elections, but it is not only about the legitimacy of the elections. It can also lead to a situation where people can actually nullify the results of the elections on the basis that the outcome could not have been free and fair because they were prohibited from certain things. In fact, there have been incidents in South Africa where in by-elections, certain by-elections were actually nullified by the Electoral Court on the basis that there were disturbances in those areas, and as a result, people could not actually freely access the voting station. So that has got very enormous implications in terms of the quality of the elections and integrity of the elections. Firstly, as I've indicated, in terms of the legitimacy of the elections, but secondly, in terms of possibilities of nullifying the outcome of the results of an election.
So, I mean, I read some of the rules in terms of code of conduct and what constitutes misconduct in our electoral system. Publishing false information, disrupting and preventing election events, and publishing false information that could create anger and fear. There's a lot of that concern currently. We heard the press briefing by the EFF saying there were instances, for example, where gazebos were being destroyed. If you saw what the Democratic Alliance posted, there was an incident where I think one of their vehicles was pelted with stones as they were conducting their campaigns. And people look at that and they say, is the IEC capable of dealing with that degree of electoral misconduct? Because, for example, there was a period when our parliament was peaceful. The president would come in and read the State of the Nation address and then go out, and it would be normal. It was a particular routine until the EFF came into power, and we saw all sorts of disruptions to the State of the Nation address, and people being kicked out, and police are not supposed to be in, and so on and so forth, to the point now that there are new rules that have had to be put in to be able to deal with that degree of disruption. Is the IEC ready for the kind of disruption that comes with 300 or so parties that are contesting for this 2024 election?
No, the Commission will never really have the capacity to be able to deal with all those issues. And hence the legislation has been structured in such a manner that you don't really have to refer every matter to the Commission. Some of the issues can be referred to the Electoral Court. Some of them are regarded as prohibited conduct, which makes them actually criminal acts, and therefore they've got to be referred to the police. You know, so the Commission will never have the capacity, no matter how much you give it powers and resources, to be able to deal with each and every complaint that is happening. And then, as I've suggested, the legislation divides the kind of the issues in terms of how those issues should actually be referred to various institutions, right, to the police, and for the police to investigate, and then others to the Electoral Court. You don't need to go to the Commission in order for you to refer the matter to the Electoral Court. You can approach the Electoral Court directly. But the Commission also will look at some of those if they are in line with the framework of the legal framework. For instance, the legislation, Section 55 of the Electoral Act, deals with what we commonly refer to as the objections material to the outcome of the results of the elections. So before the Commission can announce the outcome of the results of the elections, they've got 48 hours within which they've got to attend to them. Now that is a preserve of the Commission. They've got to deal with Section 55 objections before they can actually announce the results of the elections. And then they cannot announce the results of the elections within 48 hours, because 48 hours is reserved for the purpose of dealing with those objections that are material to the outcome of the results of the elections.
Have the sanctions ever been meted out? I see one of them is a fine or an imprisonment of a particular. In your experience, has anyone ever been arrested in South Africa for electoral misconduct?
I can't recall outrightly, but there have been quite a number of cases that have actually been referred. Sometimes those cases are dealt with through conciliation. The Commission has got another instrument, I think, if I'm not mistaken, is Section 106 of the Electoral Act, where they can actually conciliate between the parties that are raising issues. So it does not mean that each and every aspect that is brought before the Commission necessarily will end up in penalty. If it is possible to deal with those through conciliation, Section 106 of the Electoral Act will provide the framework within which that can actually be attended to.
So, and I think that's quite important what you're raising. One of the issues that I heard the chairperson of the IEC speaking about is that the parties themselves have got to bring the matters to the Commission or to the Electoral Court or to the police that would need to deal with them. If those complaints don't arise, is the IEC able to itself activate certain particular investigations?
The IEC does not have the investigative powers, so it will not actually be able to move around and try to check as to whether there is a strict adherence to the provisions of the Code of Conduct. It is only when matters are brought to it that it can actually investigate those kind of issues. But it cannot initiate an investigation in an environment where there are no complaints.
Yeah. Let's talk then about the other issue. I mean, we heard the finance minister announcing, I think it's a 200 million rands fund to parties, and these are parties, I believe, who are represented already in either the national or the provincial government. Does this in any way help to level the playing field for all parties to compete in this political arena? Because I believe a third of that goes to equally to all the parties, and I think 2/3 of that is then allocated in proportion of seats of the parties.
Well, it helps in terms of deepening electoral democracy. But there are still weaknesses, in my opinion, about the Party Funding Act. And that weakness is the fact that the fund is not actually used as an instrument of transformation. And the reason why I'm saying this is because at the time when I was still part of the commission, when we started with this particular process, we had actually changed the formula to be 70-20-10. 70% being the money being distributed proportional to the number of seats that a political party has. And then 20% we had said should actually be on the basis of the number of women that a particular political party has in parliament. And then 10% would then be distributed equitably. Wow. So, that would actually be a major step in terms of dealing with the issues of transformation and forcing the political parties to include women in their lists. Because some of the political parties, as you know, because it's a voluntary process, will continue with the disadvantage that women have. Right. But if we had actually, if we can move to the level where we change the formula that is used and then use the Party Funding Act as an instrument of transformation in order to try to get more women to be in parliament, then the only solution is to change the formula to make it 70% to be distributed according to proportional to the number of seats that the political party has, and 20% of that should be on the basis of the number of women that a political party has in parliament, and then that the 10% can then be distributed equitably, depending on how many parties you have.
I hear young people saying, why stop at women? Why not also have a proportion for young people represented in your party? Because you know what people say about our parliament is it's a retirement village, basically, as they're saying. And we need new thinking to come into play.
Yeah, of course. I mean, it's an important consideration, but let's look at the historical disadvantage that women have suffered. And then we've got to try to find instruments that can actually be able to address that historical disadvantage that women have suffered. Young people, of course, have been involved, and it is important that they are there. But let's deal with the serious inequality that we've got within the society. That inequality refers to the way women have, over the years, been treated. And then, therefore, in order to get more women to participate in electoral processes, let us have a formula that will actually make it compulsory for political parties to include them.
Tselane, I appreciate your time. Thank you very much for coming in this evening. Are there adequate institutional frameworks for mediating and managing electoral misconduct in South Africa? That's a question for you. In other words, in simple terms, is the system able to hold those who commit electoral misconduct accountable? 072-110-5584. You can weigh in on that conversation, or otherwise you can drop us an X at Newzroom 405.